In today's episode, I extend the scenics, create a coal yard, and someone has an accident. I've set out on a challenge to recreate Farqua, the final station on Thomas the Tank's branch line. While the Talyllyn Railway have restored Awdry's original layout, my model railway will take full advantage of all the latest innovations in the hobby. This is my most ambitious project to date, but what better way to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Railway series? Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome back to A Slice of Sodor, where I'm recreating my own version of Farqua from the Railway series and of course Thomas the Tank Engine. As before, this series has very kindly been sponsored by D-Rail's Model Shop. I really couldn't have done this project without them. They're really great about supporting modelers in general, and I'm going to be talking more about that later on. But with Farqua in particular, I'm very much into the scenic stage now where the layout starts to come to life, and my intention with this build has always been to create a model railway using all the latest technology to show just how far the hobby has come since Awdry built his layout. That was certainly true in the early stages where I was installing things like block detection and fancy systems to motorise the points and the level crossing. But how different are things from a scenic point of view? In the previous episode, I installed a level crossing and started to create a street scene around it. With the crossing now working though, I can begin to extend the scenics to other parts of the layout, and I'm going to continue working my way along. The plan is to have a signal box behind the railway next to the two sets of points, and then a small coal yard down the front which is served by one of the sidings. I'll start off with the scene to the rear first, and my first job here is to put down a base layer of glue. I want to introduce some height to Farqua to stop everything looking too flat, and realistically this is the only area available. With it being at the back of the layout, I'm hoping the landscape will flow nicely into this, and it'll also create a more seamless join to the back scene. The next step is to add some foam board to the glue that I've just put down. This is a really nice material to work with. It's fairly cheap and lightweight, easy to cut to shape, and very versatile too, which is always handy. Obviously it's not the thickest material out there, so for some extra height I'll add a second layer on top in the centre, and you'll notice this has a cutout in the middle. This is for the signal box to sit in, and if you weren't already aware, this is a 3D printed building available from Buggles-Kelly Station. Like everything that I've used for this layout build, there's a link to this in the description, and while this was actually intended as a box for the narrow gauge line at Crovan's Gate, I think it works really well here. The foam board has added some nice height, but the edges are a bit too harsh, and so these need to be softened using some filler. This creates a smoother gradient to the landscape, and where the foam board builds up the overall height, the filler just makes that transition more natural. Some people do like to use special modelling compounds for this sort of job, and I have experimented with those in the past myself. Generally, I found there wasn't much difference in overall finish, but pre-mixed filler like this was often cheaper and easier to use. It also dries faster in my experience too, which is a big bonus for me as I like to work quickly. On that note, once the filler was dry, I then set about painting this entire area dark brown. This will act as an absolute base layer for the scenery, representing the dirt or mud that is underneath the grass. It also stops the white of the foam board and filler showing through. I'm just using cheap acrylic poster paints for this job, so really nothing fancy. Usually I mix a little black into the brown just to get a darker colour, but aside from that it's really just a case of slapping it on. And while I've got this colour mixed up, I might as well do the front scene too. In all honesty, this area will probably have a lighter colour to it, but the dark brown is still a good base. That said, I know that some people do like to paint their baseboards grey for some reason, and personally I've never really understood why, unless of course you're modelling a much more urban scene with lots of concrete. Anyway, as you can see, I've used a larger brush for covering the general area that I'm painting. A smaller brush is then used right up against the track ballast or any areas where the larger brush could spill over onto the existing scenery. And being acrylic paint, this doesn't take very long to dry, which allows me to carry on with some other parts of the scenery. Before we continue with the scenery, I do just want to say a huge thank you to the sponsors for this series, D-Rails. As I'm sure many of you will already know, D-Rails are a fantastic model shop who cater to all of the main scales and gauges. They have a really fantastic attitude to the hobby, in my opinion, and they're always willing to go above and beyond for their customers. They're certainly not like one of the big corporate retailers. Personally, I always liken it to D-Rails having the atmosphere and friendly staff of your local model shop, but with the convenience of being able to order online. Don't forget as well that D-Rails are also running their 369 deal in conjunction with this series too, and that means you can get a multi-buy deal on the Pico bullhead turnouts. That's the track system that I've used for this layout, and I'm really liking it. I think it looks amazing. And so if you want to use it on your layout as well, you can get a discount off the points at drails.co.uk/TMRG. I'll put a link to that down in the description as well. And yeah, basically the more points you buy, the bigger of a discount you get. It's fairly simple, really. But yeah, really appreciate D-Rails sponsoring this series. It wouldn't have been possible without them. Anyway, having started the landscape for the back half of the layout, now it's time to turn my attention to the front. Looking back at the street scene, I have two more buildings to add here from Buggles Kelly Station. You might recognise them as they're based off the barber's shop from the Railway series that Duck crashes into in A Close Shave. Now, I haven't finished painting these up yet, but I do really like the faded paint effect that I've managed to get on the clapboard here. Because the pavement is raised up though, the buildings do sit a little bit low at the moment. Customers would have to step down into the building from street level, but luckily I can do something about this. With the building out of the way, I can add a layer of cork in underneath. When the building is put back in place, it raises it up to the same height, so this seems like the way to go. To make this more permanent, I'll put down some glue so that I can stick the cork in place. And the cork is then glued down. Now you could quite easily use a large sheet of cork here cut to the correct size. The only reason I'm using strips for this is because this is the same cork I use under the track, and so it makes more sense to get it pre-cut to this shape. Once it's glued down, I'll trim away the excess using a modelling knife along the edge. I find it's much easier to make the material a little long and then cut it back to be flush, rather than trying to line up everything perfectly. Like with the foam board earlier on, I'll add a little bit of filler along the edge of the cork just to blend this into the landscape. And once dry, this can then be painted brown again. And not forgetting to paint the rest of the cork surface brown as well. With that dry, it's really time to crack on with the scenics though and get some ground textures down. Again, a base layer of PVA glue is added to the entire area, and this will hold the main layer in place. For the coal yard, I'm mainly going to use the universal base texture from the True to Scale range, which you can see I'm just dropping straight into the glue. This will create a sandy gravel-like texture to create some nice variety at the front of the layout. I deliberately wanted a lighter colour for this area as I'm adding it right across the front where the coal yard will be situated too. My plan is to add lots of dirt and grime around this area, and that will show up a lot better if it's going over the top of a lighter texture rather than something that was already fairly dark. The only section that isn't getting the base texture is the area between the track, where I'm opting for universal ground cover instead. This is a fine dirt-like scatter, which, as I've said in many videos now, is one of my favourite products to use. It's great for creating a verge in these sorts of areas, or just for some texture to cover up the baseboard, and you can use this as a base for lots of different techniques. As I said, I do also want to dirty up the base texture a bit as well, and so the ground cover is used for this too. I drop this on from a bit of a height, which scatters the particles out more for wider distribution. Overall, this adds some variation in to stop the colours being too consistent across the area, and it dulls down the tone as well. In general, you don't want these areas to look too perfect, and so adding in some dirt makes the scene feel a bit more grounded and realistic. Of course, while that base layer is sitting in the PVA underneath, these additional layers added on top do need to be sealed in place. After a quick spray with some water, I used the ballasting glue solution, just adding drops consistently across the area to make sure everything is covered. This will lock all of those additional textures I just added in place, and once the glue dries it hardens as well to create a much more durable surface, which is perfect for adding more scenics to later on. While we wait for that to dry, I do just want to talk quickly about the signal box area and some changes that I've made here. Now, those familiar with Awdry's layout of Farqua will know that this area was the site of the oil siding on his layout, but as I explained back in episode 1, I've opted to omit that. Now, I've done this for a few different reasons, but mainly to avoid overcrowding things. Personally, I just didn't feel like this siding added anything in particular, and for me, having a bit more space for scenery is actually much more important. Remember as well that my boards are slightly smaller than the ones that Awdry used on his layout, and I've also added the level crossing into this too. But there was another reason for removing the oil siding, and that was because I think it's actually a really nice spot for a signal box. I have to admit, the overhead box on Farqua Mark II never really appealed to me, and I like the idea of this station having something a bit smaller. Now it's situated opposite the spurs for the quarry line, and it's right next to the crossing too, so overall this felt like a much better site for the way I envision Farqua in my head. I see this more as a quiet countryside station at the end of the line, rather than a busy, bustling branch line terminus that, perhaps is closer to what Awdry depicted. And that's not to say that either version is better than the other, they're just different takes on the same thing. And like I've said from the beginning, my intention with this build was to do my own version of Farqua rather than trying to recreate an exact replica of what Awdry did. Overall though, on a congested layout like this, the change does give me some open space for a little bit of greenery, and that's what I'm going to tackle next. I'm eager to get some static grass on the landscape behind the railway, but before I can do that, I want to add a small dirt path from the signal box to the crossing. To do this, I'm just adding PVA to the landscape, following the route I want my path to take. This also seemed like a good opportunity to add a dirt verge alongside the track as well, so more PVA was laid here too. Again, the universal ground cover was called into action to create the texture for the path. But some people might opt to cover all of their landscape with a dirt texture like this, but personally I rarely bother to do that. Most of it's going to be covered up by the grass anyway, so instead I choose to focus it around the areas where it'll actually be seen, like these pathways or areas where I deliberately want the grass coverage to be thinner. With the scatter all down, a hand vacuum is then used to clear up the excess. This reveals the pathway properly, and of course the excess can be saved for reuse later on. The next step is to add some of my flexible dry stone walling to create a boundary to the railway. You can see it curves nicely around the corner here, and it'll also work really well over the contours of the uneven landscape as it rises up and falls away. The walling plays another important role here too, as it'll hide that 90-degree join between the baseboard and the future back scene as well. The pathway is now dry, and so it's time to get cracking with the static grass. Again, PVA glue is added to the surface, which is what I'll use to hold down the base layer. Unlike when I was painting everything brown earlier on, I do use a smaller brush in some areas just so that I can get right up to the walling. Basically, anywhere you want grass, there needs to be glue in order for the base layer to stick. 2mm summer static grass is then applied to the area, and basically what's happening here is that the applicator I'm using is giving the fibres a static charge. It's hard to see here with such short fibres, but this causes them to stick upright in the glue, giving the impression of individual blades of grass. It's a really cool effect, and one that has really transformed model railways over the last decade or so. Once the PVA underneath has dried, the excess can be cleared up using the vacuum again. This once again reveals that pathway, and you can see more clearly now how this fits into the landscape around it. That said, the 2mm grass is nice, but it is a bit too neat for this line side area. So to make it look a bit more rough and wild, I'll use some layering spray so that I can add an extra layer over the top. I'm just using some newspaper to shield the wall from the glue spray, and similarly I've used masking tape to cover up the pathway too. This time I'm using 4mm spring static grass, which is slightly longer and also has a less vibrant, more muted colour. Mixing the two layers together like this works really well, as it creates some nice variation in the colour and length, which gives the grass a much more natural look overall. This is a standard technique that I've used on several layouts now, and it always works really well, so you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, if the grass fibres aren't fully standing up for any reason, one thing I do is run the empty applicator over the area. Again, this attracts the fibres, getting them to stand up a bit straighter if they weren't already. And with all the static grass now down, I can pull up the protective masking tape just to reveal the pathways and the verge again. To stop the edges looking too neat, I can add patchy grass in some areas by adding small blobs of PVA along the divide. The 4mm static grass is then applied directly to this, and because there's no 2mm base layer underneath, it'll look thinner and a bit more patchy, as if the grass is naturally fading out. You can really see how this area has been completely transformed in just a few steps, and it's absolutely fantastic to have a larger area of green on the layout. From static grass to coal now, it's time to turn my attention back to the front of the layout. This features a coal merchant's yard, and on my layout I'm letting this spread out a bit more. Awdry's layout also featured a cattle dock in this area too, but personally, like the signal box area, I like to take a less is more approach rather than squeezing everything in. But with that said, how am I actually going to create the coal yard? To create the coal yard itself, I have an MS Models building for the merchant's office, as well as their larger coal staiths to run along the siding. As you'll have noticed, I'm halfway through painting the building at the moment. While the side is a bit more advanced, the front is still in its very orange base coat. I'm quite pleased with the look on the staiths though, which I've painted brown with some additional weathering. These are ready to be glued in place, and then each segment can be filled up with coal. I'm just using some cheap Pico coal scatter to build up the initial height. You could use clay or something similar to fill this up, but I had this lying around, so it was a good excuse to use it. I'm trying to create different heights here, and I figured the one nearest the entrance would be lower, since that's probably the easiest one for people to get to. I'll then use true to scales coal over the top, and you can see this is worlds apart. It has a nice dusty matte finish to it, which looks much better to my eyes, so this definitely deserves to be on top. I've also added some of their finer coal dust too, which creates some variation in the size. This also covers the ground in front of the staiths quite nicely too, which naturally would get dusty and dirty over time. To take this a step further, I'll add some universal rail yard to the area too. This is an even finer coal dust, which I mostly use around loco yards for compacted dirt and grime surfaces. It is quite black though, so I'm mixing in a bit of universal Barry stockyard into the ground as well. This is a really subtle effect, but it just adds a few extra tones to the area. Of course, having done all this, I now feel like the line behind where the coal would be unloaded looks pristine in comparison. So this is also getting a covering of the various different true to scale scatters as well. And like I said, this just gives the impression that over the years coal has spilled out of the wagons or just general dirt has accumulated from the wagon sitting over this spot fairly consistently. And this comes back to the fact that even though this layout is essentially based on a set of children's stories, I still want it to feel as if it were a real location. The next step, of course, is to spray all of this with water so that I can seal it all in place. I'll start with the track first, and as this has already been ballasted, the coal dust is just sitting nicely on top of the sleepers. The coal in the staiths then has the PVA solution added to it as well. You can really see here how the glue seeps down through that initial layer to the material underneath, locking it all in place, not just the outer layer. And just for good measure, I'll do the ground in front as well. Like I said earlier in the episode, this is really useful for creating hard surfaces that you can continue to work on, but the main disadvantage is that you do have to wait overnight at least for everything to fully dry. Thanks to the magic of editing though, you don't have to wait and we can skip ahead to the next morning. With the surface now all dry, I can add the next bit of detailing to this area. That's going to be a wire fence running around the perimeter of the siding, and this will just separate the railway from everything else. I'll start off by drilling a small hole into the surface of the yard. I then insert my laser cut fence post into this, making sure the holes for the wires are facing to the side. Like the dry stone walling, these posts are available in my shop, and they come with a little spacer as well, which is really useful for knowing where to position the next post. With all the posts glued in position, I can start joining them up with fine florist's wire. I start from the bottom first, and a set of fine tweezers are absolutely crucial for this job. Now, some people do suggest threading the posts onto the wire before installing them onto the layout. I have tried that myself, but I find it a lot more tricky, to be honest. Trying to keep track of all 4 wires at once can be a nightmare, and in my experience they just keep getting tangled and bent. For me, doing it this way is a lot easier, and once you get your eye in, it's actually fairly easy. Honestly, I find this task oddly satisfying, although I appreciate that I am doing this right at the front of the layout. It might not be such an easy task if you're having to lean over the rest of your scenics and do it at a funny angle. With all 4 wires in place, the fencing looks great, and it's something that always catches my eye on model railways, so it's great to be able to include it where I can. The wire is a bit shiny though, so to stop this from looking brand new, I'll just use some of the darker weathering powders to tone them down. This does make a real difference though, and while you could use paint instead of powder, it's definitely a worthwhile step regardless. I really love how that whole scene has started to come together, and this is always the part of a layout build that really excites me, where you get to start adding the scenics and the whole thing just comes to life. Of course, I'm going to be doing lots more of this in the upcoming episodes, and if this is something that you enjoy too, you can become a channel member to watch episode 6 right away. You'll also get early access to new episodes before they're released to the public, and yeah, if you're enjoying this series and you want to see what happens next, click that join button below this video or just follow the link in the description. It's only £1.99, so like I'm always saying, it's less than the price of a coffee. I've tried to keep it as affordable as possible, and yeah, you'll also be supporting the channel as well, which is, you know, what makes these builds happen. But yeah, episode 6 is, in particular, a really cool episode. There's some detailing in particular that I'm really happy with, and yeah, like I said, you can watch that episode straight after this one by becoming a channel member, and a big thank you to everyone who has become a channel member already. Anyway, talking about the detailing, there's still a few things to add to the scene that I'm already working on. For starters, this area of dirt beside the line is looking a little bit too plain and neat for my liking. To break this up, I can add some more patches of static grass using exactly the same technique as before. The fine tip nozzle on this bottle of PVA is really useful for adding glue in small amounts to specific areas like this. These days I tend to buy larger containers of PVA considering how much of it I go through, but I've saved back this bottle because of the nozzle, and I just refill it when it starts to run out. I'll also add some of these patches to the yard as well, just to add a bit of colour here too. With all the glue in place, the 4mm static grass is then added straight to it to create a mixture of isolated tufts and thin patches. So much of this layout is dominated by track or more built up areas, so I really am taking every opportunity I can get to add more grass. And this side-on shot really shows in particular how static grass works. You can see those fibres standing up in the glue. It's a fantastic effect, and like I said earlier, I'm just using normal PVA glue and a fairly cheap applicator for this. The excess can then be vacuumed up for reuse, revealing those patches underneath which have come out really nicely. Turning my attention back to the signal box scene for a moment, I'm going to add a gate here between the two sections of walling. I figure only the signaller would have access to this area, so there needs to be some way to keep the general public out. Additionally, the grass is looking great, but I feel I can make it even wilder and more unkempt with some clump foliage. So to achieve this, dots of PVA glue are added around the area fairly randomly. Clump foliage from Woodland Scenics is then pressed into the glue, creating little bushes and shrubs that have popped up. I tend to use two main colours for this, with the light green and medium green clump foliage being my favourites. I actually bought these bags of clump foliage a while back, and I'm still using them, so they definitely go a long way when used sparingly like this. Now, occasionally the joints in the flexible walling can be seen if it happens to rest on some uneven terrain. A bit of PVA over the joint followed by a larger chunk of the foliage, and you have a bush growing up the side of the wall, which also covers that join. The clump foliage really does help to break up the scene and make it feel more natural. Again, it's another texture and colour to add some interest to the scene, and in reality this grass wouldn't be mowed on a regular basis, so it does make sense for it to feel a bit more rough and wild. While we're in this area, the pathway for the signaller leads back to the station, but at some point they're going to need to cross over the track. So I've laser cut a little barrow crossing which I can fit around the rails. I think this looks great, and thanks to the laser cutter it was really quick to make. I could have easily spent a whole morning fashioning this myself, but this took no time at all to get it cut on the machine, and it fits in perfectly too. Of course, I still want to check that by running some rolling stock over it. Thankfully though, the wheels aren't catching and there haven't been any derailments since, so all is well. There's just a couple of quick jobs left to do, like trimming the wire ends down on the fencing now that these have all been glued in place. I'm also going to add another gate and some fencing from the crossing which will join up with the wire fencing. This just fills in this gap nicely, and while this is mostly going to be hidden by a building, at least I'll know it's there. The scenic work may now be complete, but the area is looking a little empty without the buildings. So let's get these back in place, starting off with the two Barbers buildings, which I've done a bit more work on now. One has been named C&B Barber, as seen in the TV series, and the great thing about this particular building is it's presented in the smashed up state after Duck went through the wall in a close shave. For the die-hard Thomas fans out there, I do realise that this happened at Crosby, not in Farqua, and I'll fully admit that I got initially mixed up with the story where Thomas crashed through the wall of a station master's house instead. Anyway, I still think it's a cool building to have on the layout, so I'm doing a little bit of lore bending here to include it anyway. And the second building you'll have noticed is for A.W.Awdry & Co. This is the fictional company created by Awdry, who supposedly built many parts of the railways on Sodor. This was a no-brainer for me, given that the whole layout is based off of Awdry's work, so I wanted to have a nod to him front and centre. Behind this, additional work has been done to the pub too. In his book on the history of Sodor, Awdry does mention that one of the pubs in Farqua was called the Toby Jug, and was suitably renamed once a certain tram engine arrived on the railway. You can see I've added some signs to reflect this, and I think having this pub be right next to the crossing is perfect, as in Awdry's timetable for Farqua, Toby does sometimes stop at the crossing to let off passengers. I could just see the local quarry workers jumping down from Henrietta and heading straight into the pub after a hard day's work. The signal box has also been reinstated, and I've done a lot more work on this too. It's looking really good now with the green framing, and this follows the colour scheme that Awdry used on his version of Farqua. Not to mention I've added some running boards across the front there too. And finally we come to the coal merchants building, which you can see I've named Old King Coal, obviously a pun on the nursery rhyme there. Now, I can't take any credit for this, of course. Awdry had a private coal wagon on his layout with this on, and since I was including the coal merchant at Farqua, I figured I'd give them a base of operations. Overall, the full scene is looking really nice, and I'm so pleased with how the layout is looking. It blends in really nicely with the work I'd already done up by the crossing, and with this entire board now having scenery on it, it does mean that a third of Farqua is now complete. It was a beautiful morning on the island of Sodor. The birds were singing as the town of Farqua prepared for the busy day ahead. But then there was trouble. Thomas's crew hadn't put his brakes on properly and he started to roll away. Moving faster and faster, he ran down a siding until... Thomas had crashed into a barber's shop at the end of the line. He couldn't remember that being there before. Thankfully, Donald was nearby and was all too happy to show what a big, strong engine he was. He pulled up behind Thomas in the siding and coupled up to him to pull him out of the wreckage. So I do hope you've enjoyed this episode, everyone, and if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the next episode, I'll be carrying on with the scenics and finally starting work on the station. So don't forget, if you want to watch that video right now, you can become a channel member to get early access to new videos. And just so you know what's coming up, here's a little look at the next episode. Work continues on the platforms, I create a loco yard, and more details are added to Farqua.